So again, welcome to the webinar. This is the Understanding the ISO 9001-2015 Transition, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. My name is Mike Stimson, and I'm the Manager of Quality Services at CONNSTEP. I oversee the development and delivery of quality management system and certification services. And with the September 2018 deadline fast approaching, we're excited to present this webinar to you today in an effort to facilitate your transition. Beyond just the need to transition, there are also some elements of the new standard that we at CONNSTEP believe can add real value to your company if they're implemented thoughtfully and purposely. And we look forward to sharing those with you. Before we get into the details of the webinar, I'd like to get a temperature check of the group as to what it is that you're most concerned about regarding the transition. So if you will, please take a few seconds to answer the following question. Please only choose your top concern, and we'll take a look at the results in a minute. So I'm going to launch an interactive poll. Which should be visible to you now. Okay, I can see the results building here. We'll give it just a few more moments. Okay, great. So let's take a look. All right, so what it looks like, the majority are most concerned about the risk-based thinking elements and how to implement them, followed by how to understand and apply the context of the organization. This is pretty consistent with what we've seen with the various workshops that we've conducted with our clients over the previous months. So that's good to see. We've got some pretty good consistency here. All right. So let's go back to if you just give me a second, I'll hide that poll. Okay, excellent. So one of the key concepts that we hope you take away from this webinar is that there are many aspects of the new standard that, as I said before, if you implement them thoughtfully, will enable your quality management system to add greater value to your business. And this is in keeping with CONNSTEP's overall approach to our clients, where we seek to find the synergies between various parts of their business with the goal of building the overall value. I'll be sure to point these value-adding aspects out as we go through today's presentation. So here's what we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. First, we're going to briefly look at some of the global factors that influence the changes to the ISO 9001 standard to give you a sense of why the standard changed the way it did. We'll then explore how the standard sets enhanced expectations for leaders within the company to be more involved in the planning and execution of the quality management system. Next, we're going to examine the new clauses that contain requirements to define what is called your context of the organization. And after that, we'll explain the concept of risk-based thinking and discuss ways that you may be able to use to implement it within your quality management system. After that, we're going to conclude with some likely next steps you should take to ensure your transition is smooth and on time. So let's get into the meat of this. So ISO technical committees review all standards on a roughly 8-year cycle to ensure that they continue to adapt to an ever-changing world and to allow them to place greater focus and enhance customer satisfaction. The standards need to reflect an increasingly complex organizational environment as they develop due to the changes that are happening in the world, and they also review them to make sure that they address the needs of all relevant and emerging parties and stakeholders. So the last revision in 2008 was relatively minor, with no real major changes to the content of the standard. The last major revision to 9001 was in 2000, and a lot has changed since then. There's been an increasing market competitiveness and price sensitivity out there in the markets, both domestically and internationally. Many of you are impacted by that every day. In addition, the recession in the 2008 timeframe led to a lot of restructuring of companies, and in many cases they became more complex and cost conscious. And what we see is companies trying to do a lot more with fewer resources. And you only need to look at the news of recent months and say over the past year or two to get a good sense of the next two bullet items here. There's a much greater understanding of the need for risk prevention within our business processes and quality management systems. Just think of all what you've seen in the news regarding the Takata airbag recalls, or the Samsung phone battery issues, and you can readily see the need for this. Allied to that is a much greater focus in recent years on corporate reputation and governance. So another key input that affected the revision is ISO strategy itself, and their goal is to enable their standards to be used everywhere, not just within the manufacturing environment. In fact, we continue to see the growth of the ISO 9001 standard in non-manufacturing or non-traditional industries. It's being used in the service industries like insurance and banking. And we've recently helped a department of a hospital here in Connecticut to achieve the ISO 9001 2015 standard. So we see this influence of these other industries, particularly in the wording used by the technical committees while drafting the new standard. The technical committees also obtained a fair amount of feedback from users of the standard, in addition to some other stakeholders, which definitely influenced the changes, in particular the role of leadership. Finally, there's a lot of changes and activity going on in areas such as communications and how companies use technology. The ISO strategic direction took this into account when they developed the revisions to this standard. So in a nutshell, the changes in the standard represent a mind shift in a few key areas. The first of these is the approach you take within your business to satisfy the requirements of the new standard. And I often like to use in our workshops that we conduct with companies the analogy of the Heisman Trophy, where too often we see company leadership trying to hold the quality management system at hand's length, or arm's length I should say, to the rest of the business. And this is a factor that that was fed up from the users of the standard, and that the technical committee took into account when drafting the new one. So another shift in the quality is in the quality focus that you take within your organization. Oops, I apologize, I hit the button too quickly there. The goal is to integrate and align your internal processes, which then can lead to increased productivity and better results. This often leads to lower costs and shorter cycle times through a more effective use of your company's resources. And the resulting increased revenue and market share can then be obtained through more flexible and fast responses to market opportunities. So in effect, a major quality mindset shift is essentially that the quality management system or deploying a more effective quality management system can in fact be a growth strategy, not just a cost containment or a product quality strategy. So what is new? Well, there's a greater emphasis for senior managers to be involved in the quality management system. And part of that is to help identify the next two items, the relevant needs of interested parties and other aspects of what they call the context of the organization, and the application of risk-based thinking into those requirements. There's a greater emphasis to ensure that the quality management system is integrated and aligned with the strategic direction of the organization, as well as a much greater increased emphasis on the process approach. And an element that for the quality managers on the line, I'm sure picked up on very early, is that there's a much more flexible approach to the documentation requirements. And we'll go into all of these elements in some detail. So starting with the process approach, this isn't really new to ISO 9001. However, it's emphasized much more in this revision. You can clearly see this in the models used in the old standard versus that in the new. So this is a picture taken right from the ISO 9001-2008 standard. And you can see where essentially they have one set of inputs, customer requirements, that goes into their product realization process with several items kind of interacting here to ensure that the outputs meet those requirements. And they have kind of an homage, if you will, here to the continual improvement of the quality management system. But looking at the new model, you can immediately see a change in emphasis in a couple key areas. The first is leadership is front and center and involved to a much greater degree, as you can see by the dual arrows, how leadership is intended to interact with the other aspects of the quality management system. There are also some additional inputs outside of just customer requirements, something that they call organization and its context and the needs and expectations of relevant interested parties. And then the organization of the standard itself, of the clauses, is much more aligned to the classic process approach of plan, do, check, act. So what you see here is a comparison of the structure of the 2008 version to that of the 2015. Now the 2015 version is organized along the lines of what is called a high-level structure, sometimes referred to as Annex SL. And it contains 10 clauses plus an introduction, the last 7 of which are auditable. And these clauses are actually organized differently than before into a much more coherent plan, do, check, act cycle. Now, the reason for this is ISO wanted to make it easier for companies to hold multiple certifications at one time and to integrate them into combined quality management systems. So every new and revised standard that comes out from here forward will be under this new high-level structure. So we're going to go into some detail as to what is new and changed, but what I'd like to take away from this is that in many cases the old clauses of the standard have just been remapped to the new standard. For example, the need to do management reviews used to be in Clause 5 under management responsibility. It's been remapped and enhanced somewhat into Clause 9, which makes a lot more sense given that this is, in fact, a check function. The review of the results of the amount of the quality management system is, in fact, checking. So this slide shows the organization of the 2015 version in a little more detail. And again, you can clearly see how the clauses of the standard are organized in accordance with the process approach, with clauses 4 through 7 being the plan cycle, clause 8, the do, 9, which is performance and evaluation, the check, and improvement in clause 10, the act. So I'm going to highlight for you some of those clauses that are either new or significantly changed. Again, a lot of them just got mapped over into a new location, but there are some new and changed clauses. The first two are clauses 4.1 and 4.2, collectively known as part of the context of the organization. Clause 4.4 is the interactions of processes, their interactions and their sequences. That's not new, but there have been some additions that we'll go into in a second. The Leadership and Commitment Clause 5.1, again, not new, but there are some additional requirements. And Clause 6.1, this is the risk-based thinking clause that everybody indicated as being one of the top concerns. We're going to go into this in some detail, but this helps identify or lays out the methods by which we need to address risks and opportunities. Now, the other clauses in the standard aren't new, but there are some revised elements. For instance, in clause 7.1, resources, there's a subclause, 7.16, having to do with organizational knowledge. We're going to go into the details of that because it's kind of an important clause in being new. But the rest of clause 7 remained fairly the same. One thing I want to point out about clause 7.3, which is making sure that the folks under your control are aware of both the quality management system, its objectives, and the policies. That actually gets extended beyond your four walls now into all those key subcontractors over which you have control. So something to keep in mind that hasn't been talked about much. So I want to take just a moment to discuss documentation. So the documentation's requirements are much more flexible to allow you to organize your quality management system to the needs of your business, and they're much less prescriptive as to how you do this. So in other words, the new standard outlines what you need to do, but it does not dictate necessarily how you need to do it. For example, the old standard included the requirement to have 6 required documented procedures, one of which was the control of documents. The new standard says you must exert control over your documentation. However, it doesn't specify that you need to have a documented procedure, just that you do it. Now, does this mean that we're going to go out and throw away all the procedures that are adding value today? No, there's no need to do that. But the goal is to allow you the flexibility to document your system in a way that will optimize its effectiveness and better align it to your business. So at this point, I'd like to get a sense of how many companies have purchased and reviewed the 2015 standard. So I'm going to launch another quick poll, and please mark your answer, and I'll share the results in a moment. Okay, the results are pouring in. And with 80% of the votes counted, let's see what we have. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. It looks like approximately 2/3 of you out there have actually purchased and have read, at least to some standard or to some point, the new standard. But a third of you haven't. That's going to have some implications when we start talking about the timeline. So keep those in mind. Okay, let me hide that. And we'll continue on. So the next thing I want to talk about is leadership and the expectations. And essentially what the standard is asking us to do is to make quality an enterprise-wide effort. So as I mentioned before, we've conducted approximately 30 workshops thus far with our clients to assist them in understanding the implications of the changes to the standard. And most of these workshops have been with company leadership. As part of that, we asked the participants to describe what comes to mind when they hear the words management and leadership. So under management, we got a lot of common results that talks about planning, coordinating, evaluating, facilitating actions, budgeting, etc. Fairly tactical type of actions. But when they talk about leadership, there's a difference in the flavor, if you will. We saw things more like inspire and motivate, to create a direction, the need to communicate and empower. And another key one that came out here was ownership. So if we look at clause 5.11, which describes the role that leaders are expected to play, and you compare them to the results of that brainstorming exercise that I just showed you, I think you'll see a few similarities. So 5.11 states that top management shall demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the quality management system by taking accountability for its effectiveness. That's that ownership part that I believe we just saw in the brainstorming. To make sure that it's compatible with the context and strategic direction of the organization. That's more the vision. Ensuring that it's integrated within the organization's business processes, as well as promoting the use of risk-based thinking. So I think we intuitively know what leadership means, as you know, as vis-a-vis what management means. And hopefully you can see how that vision of leadership is incorporated into the standard, and it gives you a sense of the type of things that they expect leaders to do. Now, another area in which leadership is expected to be engaged is, of course, the management review. This isn't new, okay, but you'll notice that there are a few new inputs that leaders must take into account that are much more focused on that high-level vision model, if you will, of what leaders do. So for instance, they need to take into account or review changes in external and internal issues. Now that's a little bit undefined for us right at this point because we're going to talk about that next. But essentially what they're asking leadership to do during the management review process is to ensure that the quality management system remains aligned with the business goals and objectives. Another area that's new is the effectiveness of actions taken to address risks and opportunities. Again, clause 6.1 is new. It's the risk-based thinking clause. So they want leaders during the management review process to ensure and to take accountability of the actions that they are taking to ensure that these risks and opportunities are addressed. The rest of it remained pretty much the same. We've always had to judge the performance and effectiveness of the quality management system, ensure customer satisfaction, obtain feedback from relative interested parties. But note that this is more than just customers. We're going to get into what they mean by interested parties in just a second. So to kind of summarize the expectation of leadership in the 2015 standard, the first is that to ensure that the policy is communicated, understood, and applied across the organization. And one of the learnings that we've gotten from working with clients who have actually made the transition and feedback from the certification body auditors is that this needs to extend beyond just the four walls. It's not just your employees who this has to get communicated to, but anybody over which you have substantial control and contributes to your process. So that's a little bit change from the previous standard. They also need to ensure that the quality requirements are integral to the overall business processes, as we've stated before. And then promote awareness and the adoption of the process approach. Of course, ensure that the resources required for the operation of the quality management system are made available, and that it's actually achieving the results intended. So that's the ownership part of leadership that we talked about earlier. Okay. All right, so let's take a quick look at the new element called context of the organization. And defining the context is one of the principal ways that leaders ensure that the quality management system is aligned with the rest of the businesses, or the rest of the business. And so it's an important clause to understand. So clause 4, context of the organization, contains some elements that existed in previous versions. For instance, the scope of the quality management system, which is now clause 4.3, and the identification of processes and their interactions and sequences, clause 4.4, have existed in previous versions. Now 4.4 is a little bit added to. There's been some additional requirements which we'll go into in a minute. But it's the approach you take to identifying your scope and identifying the processes that's different. And the first is to look at what they call relevant issues that could impact your quality management system and your business. And these issues can be either internal or external to your company. Then to take a look at the interested parties other than just customers. These could be suppliers, regulatory agencies, key shareholders, parties such as this. Identify what their requirements are and ensure that the quality management system addresses those. So while the scope and the processes remain the same, our approach to how we get there has changed. And since this provides an opportunity to align the quality management system with your overall business goals and to maximize its value to your organization, we feel this is an area that, if done right, could really help drive value for your company. It implies a much more involved role for top management as they're integral in helping to identify these key issues, internal and external, as well as the interested parties. So let's take a look at what clause 4.1 actually says. The organization shall determine, and every time, as you know, we see the word shall, that's prescriptive. They need to determine the internal and external issues that are relevant to its purpose and strategic direction. And relevance is key. That helps us draw the boundaries in the scope of our quality management system. And that affect our ability to achieve the intended results of the QMS, and that we must monitor and review them periodically. the standard goes on to include that these issues, internal and external, can be both positive and negative, or I should say, or negative. In other words, it isn't, when we hear the word issue, we tend to think negative, but these could also be positive factors that could impact our business that we should take into account. Some examples that they give as to what these issues could be are things around legal, technological issues, maybe competition, local environments and the economic environments. They give examples for internal issues as the company's values and culture, the workforce, the knowledge and performance of the organization. I mean, all examples of the type of issues that we need to take into account. And then clause 4.2 talks about the needs and expectations of interested parties. And again, this goes beyond just customers. And it's due to their effect or potential effect on the organization, we must determine who they are, the requirements of them, and again, only have to look at those who are relevant to the quality management system and its purpose. So this allows us to draw some fences around the determination of these interested parties. This isn't a game of the 7 separations to Kevin Bacon type of thing where we could theoretically find an interested party in just about anything out there. You know, it has to be relevant to the quality management system. And of course, there's the need to continuously monitor and review them, primarily through the management review process. So essentially, your scope of the quality management system now has to encompass not only the requirements of your products and services, but also these other 2 contextual issues: external and internal issues, and the expectations of interested party. Now, from a practical standpoint, and based on the experience we have with working with clients today, it's likely that no changes to your current scope definition is going to be required, because you probably intuitively took the environment into account when you set up your current system. We should, however, bounce that current definition against the context elements that you identify, just to make sure that it's relevant and all relevant aspects have been accounted for. So again, clause 4.4, the determination of the processes required to operate your quality management system, their interactions and sequences, isn't new. We've always had to identify essentially what I'll call the infrastructure that support our processes, whether that be equipment, materials, etc. You know, the human resources type of infrastructure that's involved, the documentation, you know, the instructions, forms, process maps, etc. I mean, that has always been there. But the 2015 standard is more specific and has added a couple new elements. The first of these is we need to explicitly identify the required inputs into our processes. Again, this was always implied before, but it's now explicit. So you can expect an auditor to be looking for some documentation as to what those inputs are. In addition, we have to identify the expected outputs of our processes, as well as assign ownership for them. So the previous version of the standard did encourage us to have KPIs, the key performance indicators, but what they're asking us to do now is to ensure that ownership for the various key processes is made or established, and that there's a link to the overall business. The need to improve our processes is not new, but it has been re-emphasized. So since the requirement to determine our processes as well as their sequences and interactions is not new, it's likely that what you have today is a very good starting point. You may, however, need to add who owns the various processes. I can tell you that in some cases we work with clients who are very good at this, and they have ownership on all key areas of their business process as well as good metrics tied to them. Others are less so. So you may need to add this into what you have today and when you describe your processes. You'll also want to ensure that your quality management system supports the entire scope as defined by your context and your products and services, and that you integrate any supporting processes such as human resources or possibly strategic planning that are necessary. Okay, we're going to shift now to the concept of risk-based thinking. And risk-based thinking is now a focal point throughout the standard. It's actually in more areas than clause 6.1, but we're going to start our examination there. So risk-based thinking is something we basically do automatically and often subconsciously to get the best results that we're seeking. And the concept of risk has always been implicit in ISO 9001. This edition, however, makes it more explicit and builds it into the whole management system. The purpose of this graphic is to identify that the risk-based approach is really not much different than the process approach, just with a slightly different focus, and that risk identification and risk assessment are part of our plan cycle. Risk action management is the do, and risk reporting, monitoring, and follow-up are all part of the ACT, part of the PDCA. The other thing about risk-based thinking is that it makes preventive action part of more strategic and part of your overall operational planning. So it's not something that's done at the end, which was tended to be done in the past, but it's actually the concept of preventive action is incorporated up front in the planning sequence. So in the 2015 revision, risk is defined as the effect of uncertainty on an unexpected result. So you notice that it isn't saying that it's necessarily bad, just that it's unexpected. You're getting a result that you did not expect. And then in the standard, there's a note 4 that says that risk is often expressed in terms of the combination of the consequences of an event and the associated likelihood that the event happens. So that's what we see here, where we often look at risk as a combination of the probability that something would happen and how bad it is if it does. And obviously anything with a high probability and high severity is an area that we want to pay more attention to than its opposite number here, the low probability and severity. So here's what clause 6.1.1 actually says. And you'll notice it starts out with planning for the quality management system. Again, we're bringing this up forward. The organization shall consider the issues referred to in 4.1, which again is the internal and external issues you identified during your context, as well as the requirements of the interested parties that you identify and refer to in 4.2, and then determine the risks and opportunities that are associated with them and that need to be addressed in order for your system to achieve its intended results. This ties nicely together the three elements we're discussing today: leadership, context, and risk, because this essentially has to be a leadership function. You know, they need to be involved in helping to determine this. So there are a few implications of Clause 6.1. The first is that any actions taken to address risk or opportunities have to be proportionate to its potential impact. So you have to have a way of comparing risks and assigning proportionality. Another implication is Clause 8.4, which is the control of externally provided processes, products, and services, what we used to call outsourcing, extends this approach into your supply chain. And as I mentioned earlier, the risk-based approach alleviates the need for a separate clause on preventive action. It's now woven throughout the standard and, ideally throughout your planning process when you set your system up. And this last one is key. So although the risks and opportunities have to be determined and addressed, there's no requirement for formal risk management or a documented risk management process. And this is where I think most companies have had the most questions. If it's required to do it, how do you show that you are doing it given the fact that there's no formal requirements? I mean, it's almost counterintuitive. But there are several approaches that you can take. One of which is something that we address and teach during our workshops is the establishment of a risk register. And this is essentially, for those of you familiar with it, the application of a failure modes effect analysis, or an FMEA, to the overall process and system. So we help companies identify various categories of risks and then drill into them to identify specific risks and how they manifest themselves, and then help assess priority or impact. Again, the combination of probability and severity, so you get a sense of the proportionality. We then, this particular tool contains a section where we can enter in what our risk strategy, or I'm sorry, a risk mitigation strategy is. Easy for me to say. But the actions that we're taking to address the risks, and then what are we going to do if those actions fail? So in one nice document or tool, we have some good, strong inputs into the management review process to keep track of risks associated with our context. Now, there are other approaches that we've seen our clients use that are also very effective. One of them is the creation of process sheets that ties a lot of what we've talked about so far together. What the inputs to various processes are, who's responsible for them, how do we measure them, what are the associated risks. So each of the key processes have these type of sheets or documents. Another approach that we've seen that seems quite effective is if you use turtle diagrams to help depict your processes. You could add the risk elements into those to readily identify and review them periodically. But again, risk-based thinking is throughout the standard, not just in Clause 6.1. For example, anywhere that we're required to manage change is an application of risk-based thinking. And we see this in Clause 6.3 in organizational knowledge, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail in a second. Controlling operational changes, managing changes to design and development if that's within your scope, and addressing changes affecting production. So all of these clauses, in effect, are the application of risk-based thinking throughout the standard. And the benefits should be fairly self-evident. It helps your business continuity, makes it easier to understand potential consequences prior to implementing change, and ensures that the integrity of your quality management system is maintained. And because we're doing this in the planning stage, addressing risks and opportunities up front, this is another area where, if done right, CONNSTEP believes will add value to your quality management system and help increase the value of it to your company. So I want to take just a minute to explain organizational knowledge. So the standard defines this as knowledge that is specific to an organization and that's usually gained by experience. So we often call this tribal knowledge. And what the standard asks us to do is to determine the knowledge necessary for the operation of our processes and to achieve conformity of products and services. It then goes on to say that this knowledge must be maintained and made available, and that when we address needs and trends, again, those context elements, that the organization consider how to gain the knowledge that will be required in the future. And the rationale is quite frankly a pretty good one. It helps safeguard the organization from loss of knowledge due to staff turnover or just for the failure to capture the information and share it throughout the organization. It also encourages the organization to acquire, learn from experience or benchmarking, and share the knowledge. Some implementation considerations. Often companies, when they conduct a project of any size, really, they'll do lessons learned, and we'll have a database as to all these things that they're learning as they're making changes or implementing new products or new processes, etc. And capturing those best practices or lessons learned is an example of capturing the organizational knowledge. Implementing good succession planning activities is another implementation consideration you should think about. And the benefits are again, fairly self-evident. It helps protect the business when there's personnel turnover. And quite frankly, with our aging workforce that's been in the news and something that I'm sure you deal with every day, this is a big thing. Because it mitigates that impact of losing key personnel and making sure that their hard-earned knowledge doesn't go away with them. Okay, so before we wrap things up, I'd like to get a sense as to how far along we are in the planning and scheduling of the transition. So I'm going to launch another poll. This will be the last one, to ask that question. So here we go. Okay, so what I'd like to know is, have you determined the date of your transition? Yes and no, and if you have, whether or not you've already scheduled it with your CB. All right, I would just give that a couple more seconds. And polls are closing. Okay, let's share the results. Okay, so it looks like about 60% of those voted have at least identified a date of transition, but only about a little more than a third have actually scheduled with their CB. Close to 40% haven't yet identified that, or identified a date to transition. Okay. All right, so what are the takeaways? So again, what the standard is asking us to do is for leadership to become much more involved in the quality management system, particularly in the identification of what they call the context of the organization, to help identify those internal and external issues and interested parties that could impact your business. And then apply the concept of risk-based thinking to the context in order to ensure that in the planning stages, the quality management system can achieve its purpose. And then in the setup and execution of it, to apply the process approach to those elements and establishing your QMS. So let's talk about a couple key dates. As I believe everybody knows, we all must be transitioned to the new standard by September 15, 2018. However, no new certifications to the 2008 version of the standard will be given after July 15th of this year. So if you have a recertification audit scheduled between July 15th, 2017 and going into next year, it's going to be to the new standard. And there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind. The first is that you're going to be required to conduct a full internal audit as well as management review under the terms of the new standard prior to your targeted surveillance or certification audit. And you probably want to allow some time between that and the audit to take whatever corrective actions. So if you back up from that point, you probably should be planning at least 6 to 9 months of implementation to get to the new standard. And there's several things that CONNSTEP can do to help. As I alluded to earlier, we've developed several workshops designed not only to explain the changes to the standard, but also to explore ways you can use to implement them effectively and obtain the most value from your QMS. These 3 workshops, one for leadership, the second for your internal auditors, and the third for team members or your employees, are all delivered at your location. And again, are designed to help build the awareness and get you started on the right path towards your transition. In addition to our workshops, we offer our standard suite of quality services that can assist you in transitioning and maintaining your QMS. And again, our approach is to find ways to build synergy between the various business processes and efforts that you undertake in order to help you create value within your business. And again, we think that there are many opportunities to do that with the changes to the standard. So at this point, what I'd like to see is just take a look at if we have any questions. And so far, no questions have been added. I'll just give it a second in case anybody thinks of something and would like to type it in. Alrighty. Well, not having seen any coming in, let's close this up. So I want to thank you for attending today's seminar, and I hope you found it to be informative and that it met your expectations. So as a reminder, you're going to receive a link to the webinar recording within a day or so, and that'll allow you to review this information and perhaps share it with some of your colleagues within your company. And if you'd like to learn more about how CONNSTEP can assist you in your transition, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. So thank you again, and good luck on your transition.